I chose to go into teaching children with learning disabilities because my own learning disabled daughter, she taught me so much about what she could do and what she couldn't do, and what she could understand and what she couldn't understand. And I come from a family of scientists, and I've done 3 courses of a degree in science before my mother's death put an end to it. So I'd done that before Jane was born. And I began to take a moderately scientific interest in what she could do and what she couldn't do. And one of the things that launched me on a particular quest was her understanding of the word more, which she could cope with totally in the context of custard on pudding, but not at all in the context of half an egg box full. So I began to question a bit further what was actually going on here. Of course, the two concepts are vastly different, but I didn't know that then. So in my local public library, which just happened to be 2 blocks away from a teacher training college, I found Richard Skemp's The Psychology of Learning Mathematics, and a lot of stuff by Piaget, and that was about all I could find on the actual business of learning maths and pre-maths. There's plenty on maths, but the actual business of learning. So eventually we got Jane into a special school where she didn't seem to be learning very much. She'd also been driven into an emotional state of total mental confusion by teachers trying to teach her to do pages of sums. And 40 years on, she has not yet recovered from that. So, on the principle, if you can't beat them, join them, I went and did a B.Ed in primary education and pursuing my own interests through courses of psychology and what learning psychology I could get hold of, and a bit on history of education, because I've always been interested in where ideas come from. So eventually I had my own class of learning disabled students, and I made it my job to stay acquainted with the literature on learning and on special needs, and to put into practice, by way of teaching materials, anything I could find that was relevant in published research. And I was also still pursuing the idea of things happening in context. So I did a lot of my teaching in the home economics room and in the woodwork room. And I remember these were pretty severely cognitively disabled 16-year-olds, but they had all sorts of stuff going for them. And I do remember that we had a project, we built a bird table, and we covered a lot of pre-measurement by taking significant pieces of string down to a local timber yard where there was a very helpful chap. And we got into discussions about short pieces of string and long pieces of string and so on. And we built this table, and it wasn't a success because the school cat came and sat under it. And that was the end of that. But the special needs inspector in those days, he rather liked the approach that I was taking, and he had already set up a unit whose sole purpose was to produce learning materials right across ILEA, which is huge, for children with learning disabilities. And he asked me to run a 2-year numeracy project there, which I did. The same thing that I was trying to do was to get hold of published research and put it into practice through the development of teaching materials. And of course we had an enormous test bed because of the size of ILEA. And then it also had its own publishing house. So we actually did quite a lot. And I put on a couple of exhibitions which to show practicing teachers where all the materials had come from, and the sort of theoretical models I had managed to put together to explain why I'd done the materials in that way. Now in the meantime, in the mainstream secondary school sector in ILEA, the Maths Inspectorate were beginning to devise a new school leaver course and exam called Everyday Maths. Do you remember Everyday Maths? The buzzwords, of course, were things like realism and relevance. And anyway, to me, that meant more about context. And meanwhile, too, in a separate part of the ILEA jungle, and it was years afterwards that I started, the 2 inspectors weren't actually on speaking terms, the further education sector had done an enormous project where they had quizzed 1,000 young people in their very first school leaver job about various skills that they did in work, one of which was numeracy, there was communication, physical practice and problem solving. And so the school's Maths Inspectorate thought it would be a very good idea to get hold of this data and use it to inform the development of the Everyday Maths project. And he'd heard about this person in special needs who was trying to put research into practice with the design of teaching materials. So he invited me to apply for this post. And in case you think it was a walkover, I don't think I've ever been grilled so hard, because the further education people put up a candidate of their own, and so it was all fairly tough, and the candidate who didn't get it spent the rest of his life, so far as I could tell, trying to unpick everything I did. Anyway, that's history. There were two sorts, basically there were two sorts of data. There were the scores. How often in the course of your work do you add fractions, use a screwdriver, or whatever. But every now and then there was context data, which was actually originally intended to be a check on the figures, on the scores. So that if somebody used the skill particularly often, they were asked to give an example of what they were doing. The researchers never intended to use that data. It was just put in as a check on the figures. Well, of course, it was far too much data, even for the big mainframe at County Hall. But I was by then working in the LKL Computer Centre down behind the elephant, somewhere down there. And because I had all this data to work on, theoretically, I was given the very latest thing in research machines computers. It was like that size, that size. And I was very privileged because I had one of the new machines whose memory had actually been doubled. So I had 2 megabytes to play with, which of course was absolutely useless for handling all this data. But I'm quite a fast typist, and I set up my own card index system and so on, and I found that I was actually being quicker plotting all these scores by hand than the people wrestling with the too many figures on the computer. But it was, as I looked at checking the context on the figures, I found that in fact it was becoming pretty clear to me that what was going on in the context data was actually distorting the skills figures. And there seemed to be two sorts of maths going on here. So I had to fight another political battle, and was allowed access to the raw data, which was then housed in an attic in County Hall. And I sat there transcribing by hand all the skills data and the context data onto a set of cards. And I found it wasn't so much distortions of numeracy scores within the context data, but actually downright contradictions. And very often when people were asked from the numeracy questionnaire, for example, how often they used a particular skill, say adding fractions, they would deny it, saying, well, never, I could never do those things. I hate it, can't do it, never did it, go away. But when they were asked about the practical skill, the same person of cutting out lengths of wood, in which handling fractions was embedded, they were perfectly happy with it. And in the workplace, of course, nobody asked them to turn upside down and multiply. So I added the numeracy revealed in the context data to the skills data I had already collected, and found a really totally different picture. And I published various reports illustrating this. You see, it's me, I was getting more and more concerned about this idea of two sorts of maths. In school, there's sums, which you can't do. In work, there's all sorts of stuff you do, but that can't be maths because you can do it. And that really was literally about the size of it. And this was a phenomenon I met over and over again. Even in the years after I'd retired, I did a project for there was a mathematician in residence at the British Institute, which was hilarious because I'm not a mathematician and I wasn't in residence. But I had quite a lot of fun with them. But I kept meeting this phenomenon again and again in women, particularly my age, this repeated statement that they can't do maths, they never do maths, any maths to do, they ask their husband, and please stop asking me about maths. Anyway, I'm far too busy because I've got to make some more hexagons for my patchwork. And so there we were again. So if you wanted to summarise the difference between school and work maths, in school, mostly, this is all rather crude distinctions. In school, you do maths sitting down, often from written instructions. In work, you get into something you need to do while standing up, and quite often somebody shouting at you to do it. In school maths, the numbers are cleaned up, so you get a reasonable answer. In the workplace, the numbers are often messy, and you may have to do some rounding off or estimate. In school, answers are usually right or wrong. In work, they're often the very best you can do under the circumstances. In school, numbers and problems are taken out of context so they can be studied separately. In work, numbers and problems are so often embedded in the job you're doing that to take them out of context renders them meaningless. And in school, it's cheating to ask your friend what to do. At work, it's a waste of time if you don't. In school, you're motivated, or not, by the possibility of some marks at the end. In work, the motivation is part of a job that you can handle, and there are many, many more differences. A major part of my job was to produce teaching materials, and there were several other projects running at the time. One in particular was producing what I would call sort of generic digging up the road problems, you know, and there's problems about a bath that somebody's left dug out. And if it takes 5 men 7 days to dig a hole, that sort of stuff. These materials were all starting from the maths that people wanted to teach, not the maths that people were actually doing. And it had been devised by maths educators who'd gone into factories, looking for examples of people adding fractions and so on. So their booklets were themed by the maths syllabus, and they had lots of pictures, a picture of Aunt Tracy standing by a lathe knowing something, followed inevitably by pages of the same old sums. And I was brooding on this problem while I was in Istanbul for a brief holiday, must have been half term, pursuing a private interest on the problems of how people put up those extraordinary domes with the technologies they had at the time, from Byzantine to Ottoman. And I took an afternoon off, and I went to the Archaeological Museum and had a look around. And this is actually true. This is really a true story. There was a case of tablets, cuneiform tablets, from Babylon. And somebody had translated these tablets into Turkish and into English. And they were school texts. And one of these tablets read, if it takes 5 men 7 days. So, you know, at times when you actually don't know whether it's you wonder what you're doing on this earth. So something had